Tony Soprano was the boss. No debate there. But let me throw something at you. If you had to build a crime family from the ground up, and you needed someone to run it for the next 10 years, not the loudest guy, not the most intimidating guy, but the one still standing a decade later, would you actually pick Tony? Or would the smarter bet be Silvio Dante? I know. That sounds wrong at first. Tony is magnetic. He dominates rooms. He's physically imposing, emotionally intense, and when he decides to scare someone, it works. He feels like power. And that's exactly why most people never question it. But this isn't about who felt the most powerful. It's about who was structurally built for leadership. And those are two very different things. Today we're digging into the psychology, the ego, the decision-making patterns, the emotional control, and we're going to be honest about where Silvio struggled too. This isn't praise, it's analysis. When people think about Silvio Dante, a few words come up instantly. Loyal, calm, consigliere. He's usually half a step behind Tony, arms folded, observing. He runs the bada bing. He keeps the books straight. He advises. He supports. He's rarely the loudest voice in the room. He's not flipping tables. He's not making dramatic speeches at family dinners. Most viewers register him as reliable background infrastructure and move on. But here's what's interesting. Staying in the background for years inside something as volatile as the DiMeo crime family? That's not passive. That's controlled positioning. Silvio chose his role, and he maintained it deliberately. There's a version of Silvio where he pushes for his own crew, demands more authority, creates friction to climb higher. He never does. And the show doesn't frame that as weakness. It frames it as awareness. Silvio seems to understand something most of the men around him don't. Value isn't in being seen constantly. It's in being right when it counts. Now let's talk about anger. Tony's anger is practically its own character in the series. It's explosive, unpredictable, and it costs him. It costs him relationships. It costs him alliances. And sometimes, it costs him strategically correct decisions. He beats people in parking lots. He chokes people at dinner tables. He lashes out in moments where composure would have served him better. And look, that volatility makes him compelling to watch. It's entertaining. It's cinematic. But magnetism isn't stability. Silvio, in high-pressure moments, doesn't perform calm. He embodies it. There's a stillness to him. He absorbs tension instead of amplifying it. He listens. He processes. He contains. That's emotional regulation. And in leadership, that's power. When a boss loses control publicly, three things happen. First, everyone senses instability. Second, the room now has to manage the boss's emotions on top of the actual problem. And third, people start filtering information out of self-protection. Tony's temper creates information bottlenecks. Bad news gets softened, delayed, sometimes hidden, not because people are disloyal, but because they're conditioned to avoid the blast radius. Silvio doesn't create that environment. He's the guy you can tell the truth to. And in any organization, criminal or corporate, the leader who receives accurate information makes better decisions. Emotional containment isn't weakness, it's structural stability. Now let's address the big moment. When Tony is incapacitated and Silvio steps in as acting boss. This stretch tells us almost everything. And yes, Silvio struggles. He's stressed. He loses sleep. The weight clearly hits him. That matters. But look at how he operates. He consults before deciding. He doesn't freelance. He doesn't try to reinvent the hierarchy. He understands that the job in that moment is continuity. An acting boss who starts reshuffling power and settling personal scores is destabilizing the system. Silvio holds the line. Contrast that with Tony's instinct under pressure. When uncertainty rises, Tony asserts dominance harder. He personalizes instability. His authority becomes the answer to every question, even when patience would have worked better. There's also something revealing about the fact that Silvio visibly doesn't want the top seat. He carries it like a burden, not a prize. And that's important. In serious organizational contexts, the person who wants power the most is often the least equipped to handle it responsibly. Hunger distorts judgment. It makes decisions personal. Silvio doesn't chase power, and that's exactly why he might have been capable of wielding it cleanly. Here's the core difference. Tony leads with identity. His authority is inseparable from his ego. When someone disrespects Tony, it's not just structural, it's personal, and he reacts like it's personal. Silvio leads with structure. When Silvio enforces something, it's about hierarchy, not pride. He can correct someone without turning it into a blood feud. That's rare. The Sopranos is filled with men undone by ego. Christopher's need for validation, Ralphie's recklessness, Tony's constant craving for emotional confirmation, from Melfi, from his mother's ghost, from the ducks in his pool. Silvio doesn't seem to need that. He knows who he is. And that kind of ego stability is incredibly valuable in a hierarchy built on tension. Now, the counter-argument. Silvio doesn't thrive as acting boss. The pressure visibly affects him. Tony seems built for carrying command indefinitely. That's fair, but context matters. Silvio never pursued the role. He wasn't groomed for it. He stepped in during crisis conditions, with enemies circling and uncertainty everywhere. Struggling under those circumstances doesn't equal incapability. It might simply mean he was operating in a position he never sought, under maximum strain. There's a difference between failing and being unwilling. When Tony returns, Silvio steps back without resentment. No power grab, no ego flare. Just back to position. That tells you something. So where does this land? Tony Soprano commands fear. Silvio Dante commands respect. Fear is effective short-term. It produces immediate compliance, but it's expensive. It builds resentment. It creates people who follow only when watched. Respect compounds. It creates loyalty that survives vulnerability. Tony's organization runs heavily on fear, and throughout the series, you see cracks in that foundation. Flipping, scheming, waiting for weakness. Under Silvio, I'm not sure it fractures the same way. And then there's sustainability. Tony's leadership requires Tony to be fully present, dominant, emotionally charged. The moment he's compromised, illness, distraction, crisis, the structure wobbles. Silvio's style is less dependent on performance. It's quieter, more institutional, less ego-driven. That's durability. Zoom out for a second. The Sopranos repeatedly shows us the gap between the performance of power and the reality of it. The loudest man in the room is rarely the most secure. Tony constantly performs authority. Silvio simply holds his position. Tony unravels slowly because he can't stop needing confirmation of his dominance. Silvio doesn't need applause to function. That's quietly powerful. So was Silvio Dante built to be boss? Or was he exactly where he was always meant to be? The answer depends on how you define leadership. If leadership is spectacle, intimidation, and presence, Tony wins. If leadership is stability, durability, and building something that survives you, Silvio makes a serious case. Let me know where you land. Was Silvio capable of more? Or was he perfectly deployed in the exact role the structure required? Subscribe if you're into this kind of psychological breakdown. No recap, no trivia, just the architecture underneath one of the greatest shows ever made. And next time, we're talking about the one mistake Silvio Dante never made. Not once. That conversation might shift this entire argument. Until then, power doesn't always look the way we expect it to.